There is an 81-book Bible, preserved far from the gaze of the West, and perhaps you have never heard of it for a simple reason: it did not go through the same path of power, politics, and selection that shaped the 66-book Bible that most of us know. And that's exactly where the story starts to get uncomfortable and fascinating at the same time. For more than 1,600 years, in the mountains of Ethiopia, within isolated monasteries and written in Gs, monks of the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church protected manuscripts that did not circulate through Rome, were not voted on in Western councils, and did not fit easily into the official narrative of European Christianity. Texts that talk about revelations, dialogues, and teachings that remained off the radar of many people. What almost no one tells you is that among these writings are traditions that expand a lot the most mysterious period in Christian history, the 40 days after the resurrection. An interval in which, according to Acts 13, Jesus appeared, taught and revealed things but which the canonical Gospels practically silence. What if this silence is not absence, but choice? And this is where a figure that has always been present, but was almost never taken as seriously as it should be, Mary Magdalene, appears. Not the version distorted, labeled, and reduced over the centuries, but the Mary Magdalene recognized in ancient traditions as a close disciple, central witness, and even called apostle to the apostles. What did she hear in these post-resurrection encounters that few texts dared to preserve? Before continuing, write here in the comments where you are watching. This content is crossing borders, cultures, and traditions, and I want to know where this conversation is going. Because the question that remains is not just what was preserved in Ethiopia. It's what else have you never been invited to see? For a long time, almost all of us grew up believing that the Bible was always exactly as we know it today. 66 books, hardcover, organized index, and the feeling that it had always been closed, defined, unchanging. But you only need to dig a little beyond the surface to realize that all this security starts to shake. There is, indeed, an ancient Christian tradition that preserves an Ethiopian Bible with 81 books, officially recognized by the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church. This is not an alternative theory or a recent internet fad. It is a living canon, used to this day in liturgy, teaching, and spirituality, sustained by centuries of continuous practice. The shock comes when you realize that the contrast between the Ethiopian canon versus Western canon's 66 books is not just numerical. It reveals different paths of early Christianity, apostolic traditions that followed different routes, and historical decisions that shaped what each culture came to call the Bible. And perhaps the most uncomfortable part is this: if there are books removed from the Bible, texts considered lost or classified as apocryphal in the West, who decided this? In what context? And, mainly, with what interests were at stake at that moment in history? This first shock doesn't require you to change your faith, but it invites something simpler and more powerful: honest curiosity. In the same way that someone starts to read different versions of the same historical fact, here the invitation is to look at early Christianity with more layers, more questions, and less fear of investigation. When we talk about the Bible that circulates in the West, almost everyone automatically thinks of the 66 books accepted by the Protestant canon. They seem to form a closed, coherent, definitive set. But this feeling of completeness exists because we are almost never shown the other side of the story. In the tradition of the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, the Bible has not been reduced in the same way. The result is a set of 81 books, which includes texts considered secondary in the West, but central to Ethiopian spirituality. Not as a historical curiosity, but as living scripture, read and taught for centuries. This is where the Ethiopian canon versus Western canon's 66 books reveals something deeper than editorial differences. It exposes theological, cultural, and political choices made in specific contexts. While the West sought standardization, Ethiopia preserved continuity, tradition, and oral transmission combined with text. When someone hears about lost or apocryphal books, they usually imagine fragmented texts or strange ideas. But many of these writings, such as the Book of Enoch and the Book of Jubilees, survived in complete form just outside the Roman orbit. The question is no longer why do they exist, and it becomes why were we taught that we didn't matter. This contrast does not invalidate what you already know. It broadens the horizon. Just as hearing a second witness changes our perception of a fact, Looking at Christianity from more than one tradition reveals that perhaps the story was much more diverse and rich than we were told. When we try to understand how so many ancient texts managed to survive intact, the answer is less about miracle and more about geography. Ethiopia, surrounded by mountains, deep valleys, and difficult-to-access regions, ended up becoming a true natural vault of the early Christian faith. While much of the Christian world faced invasions, political disputes, and sudden changes in power, Ethiopian manuscripts were kept in Ethiopian monasteries, many of them carved into rocks, isolated from the constant flow of empires and armies. It was not isolation out of fear, but out of preservation. Regions like Lake Tana, with its centuries-old monasteries, functioned as living libraries. Monks copied texts by hand, generation after generation, maintaining not only the words, but the spiritual context in which those writings were read and taught. It was a tradition passed down on paper and in practice. This geographic isolation helped protect books that, elsewhere, were discarded, debated, or simply left aside. What the West classified as excluded or marginal texts in Ethiopia continued to be part of everyday faith, without the pressure of aligning with decisions taken far away. When you understand this, you begin to realize that the preservation of these texts was no accident. It was a cultural and spiritual choice. And this raises an uncomfortable question: how many other stories have survived simply because they were too far from the centers of power? A detail that many people ignore, but which completely changes the game, is the language in which these texts were preserved. Ge'ez, an Ethiopian liturgical language, stopped being spoken in everyday life centuries ago, but continued to be alive in rituals, sacred readings, and the transmission of manuscripts. This is important because languages that fail to evolve in common use tend to become more stable. While other traditions dealt with successive translations, cultural adaptations, and constant revisions, the texts in Ge'ez remained practically frozen in time, protecting ancient structures, terms, and meanings. In practice, this functioned as a historical capsule. Ethiopian monks learned Ge'ez not to talk, but to preserve. Each manuscript copy was made with extreme care, following strict rules, almost like a ritual. Error was not a technical detail, it was spiritual failure. When modern scholars began comparing these manuscripts with Greek and Latin versions, they noticed something curious at several points. The Ethiopic text preserved longer, more detailed passages. Not necessarily new, but less edited, less filtered. Understanding the role of Ge'ez helps break the idea that everything that did not pass through the Greek-Latin axis is inferior or late. Sometimes, what remained on the sidelines was precisely what changed the least. And this sets the stage for a larger question: if the text survived, why was almost no one in the West encouraged to read them? This is the question that naturally begins to echo in the minds of those who follow this story closely. If these texts exist, if they have been preserved for centuries, and if they are part of a living Christian tradition, why does the West almost never talk about them? The answer is not simple, but inevitably involves the idea of authority. Since the first centuries, Christianity stopped being just a spiritual movement and began to dialogue with and often depend on political power. Defining which texts would be read publicly meant defining doctrine, behavior, and hierarchy. It wasn't just faith, it was organization, control, and institutional unity. In this context, the selection of texts did not happen in a vacuum. Books that circulated in distant communities, such as African ones, had less influence on decision-making centers. Meanwhile, Rome, Constantinople, and other regions of the Greco-Latin axis began to concentrate theological and symbolic authority. This is where the inevitable hook involving the Vatican and religious politics emerges. Not as a direct accusation, but as a historical reality, institutions tend to preserve narratives that reinforce their structure. Texts that overly expanded spiritual authority, or that gave voice to figures outside the traditional male hierarchy, naturally caused discomfort. Realizing this does not destroy faith matures. Understanding that Christianity was shaped by human decisions helps us separate the spiritual message from the institutional process. And perhaps the biggest mistake was teaching us that asking questions was a sign of weakness, when, in fact, it was always a sign of sincere search. If that question, why weren't we taught this? Has it ever crossed your mind? Write "I want to know more" here in the comments. And take the opportunity to enjoy the video, because the next point comes precisely where the story becomes even more delicate and more revealing. Many people imagine that the biblical canon came down from heaven as a closed and definitive package. But the real story is much more human, full of debates, disagreements, and decisions made over time. Early Christianity coexisted, for centuries, with multiple texts circulating at the same time. The Council of Nicaea 325 often appears as villain or hero in these conversations, but the reality is more subtle. He did not single-handedly define the biblical canon, although it was an important milestone in the process of organizing the Christian faith within an empire that needed doctrinal unity. The formation of the canon took place in stages, through synods, pastoral letters, and regional consensus. What was read in one community could be rejected in another. What seems official today was, for a long time, just one of several competing traditions. Meanwhile, communities outside the Roman axis such as Ethiopia followed their own paths. The result was the preservation of books that the West, little by little, stopped copying, reading, and teaching. Not because they were unknown, but because they were not chosen to represent the final version of the faith. When you understand the canon as a historical process, something changes internally. The Bible stops being fragile and becomes more profound. And the question is no longer which text is true. To become what did each community believe was essential to transmit? One of the most intriguing details of the Christian narrative is precisely where almost no one looks carefully. According to Acts 13, after the resurrection, Jesus remained with the disciples for 40 days, appearing, teaching, and speaking about the kingdom. 40 days and very few words recorded. The canonical Gospels mention encounters, appearances, and general guidance, but leave a huge amount of blank space. There are no long speeches, no detailed dialogues, no in-depth explanations of what was taught in this decisive period. It's as if the story moves too quickly. This emptiness has always aroused curiosity in early Christian communities. If there was coexistence, questions, and teachings, why was almost nothing recorded? Or was it recorded but did not remain within the Western canon? This is exactly where the books removed from the Bible gain importance. Many ancient texts state that Jesus transmitted more reserved teachings after the resurrection, aimed at spiritual understanding, awareness, and preparation of the disciples. Not for crowds, but for those who were ready. When you put these pieces together, the 40-day period stops being a forgotten detail and becomes an unfulfilled narrative promise. Something was said there. Something was learned. And perhaps the right question is not whether there were more teachings, but who was responsible for telling them. Before any text considered apocryphal, Mary Magdalene already occupies a central place in the Gospels accepted by the West. She is the one who remains when many flee, who watches the crucifixion from afar, and who returns to the tomb when everything seems over. That, in itself, says a lot. In the Gospel of John chapter 20, Mary Magdalene is presented as the first witness to the resurrection. No Peter. Not John. Not any of the 12. It is to her that Jesus appears first, it is to her that he speaks, and it is to her that he entrusts the message that would change everything. This detail is often overlooked because we are used to seeing the story from the perspective of the later male leader. But in the context of early Christianity, this was revolutionary. Female testimony had no legal weight, and yet this tradition was preserved in canonical texts. Maria is not just an emotional supporting character in the narrative. She understands, recognizes, and responds. While others are still confused, she hears her name being called and understands. This reveals closeness, intimacy, and spiritual trust. When you read this episode carefully, it is difficult to support the idea that Mary Magdalene was just another follower. The text itself suggests something bigger, something that sets the stage for an inevitable question. If she was the first to hear it, what else did she hear afterwards? If Mary Magdalene occupies such a central place in the Gospels, the inevitable question is, how did this image become distorted over time? At some point in history, the first witness to the resurrection began to be remembered almost exclusively as a repentant sinner, when the biblical texts themselves do not say so. This association with prostitution does not appear directly in any gospel. She was born centuries later, the result of misreadings and sermons that mixed different characters into a single female figure. The effect was powerful. Mary went from being a disciple to becoming a moral warning. In the Western imagination, this change had profound consequences. A woman who hears, understands, and announces the central message of faith comes to be seen as someone who needs to be redeemed, not heard. The focus leaves spiritual authority and goes to the supposedly stained past. This erasure process does not happen by chance. In a church that was structured in an increasingly hierarchical and masculine way, the idea of a woman with apostolic authority caused discomfort. Reinterpreting his story was a silent way of neutralizing his influence. When you realize this, something rearranges itself. This is not about attacking tradition, but about recognizing how narratives are shaped. And the question that remains in the air is uncomfortable and necessary: how many other voices have been softened, distorted, or silenced by the same mechanism? When we turn from the canonical Gospels and look at the texts found in Nag Hammadi, the contrast is immediate. In the Gospel of Mary and the Gospel of Philip, Mary Magdalene does not appear as a peripheral figure, but as someone who understands teachings that other disciples still struggle to understand. In the Gospel of Mary, she consoles the disciples after Jesus' departure and reports teachings she received directly from him. The most revealing thing is not just the content, but the reaction of others. Some question whether Jesus would actually say these things to a woman. This internal tension reveals much about the dynamics of the primitive community. The Gospel of Philip deepens this closeness even further. He speaks of knowledge transmitted in an intimate, symbolic way, and suggests a special spiritual relationship between Jesus and Mary. Not in the modern sensationalist sense, but as someone receiving deep understanding, not just basic instructions. These texts do not need to be read as official doctrine to have value. They function as cultural evidence that there were Christian communities that saw Mary Magdalene as a spiritual leader, interpreter, and transmitter of important teachings. When these writings are placed alongside Ethiopian tradition and the canonical Gospels, the pattern begins to emerge. Mary does not appear as an isolated exception, but as part of a broader memory that the West ended up leaving aside. When we put all these pieces together, the silence of the Gospels, the non-canonical texts, the Ethiopian tradition, and the role of Mary Magdalenian idea begins to take shape that the 40 days after the resurrection were not just brief appearances, but an intense period of reserved teaching. Many ancient writings suggest that, in between, Jesus delivered revelations that were not intended for the masses. They were deeper dialogues, aimed at spiritual understanding, inner maturity, and the preparation of those who would continue the movement. Teachings that required listening, not just obedience. In this context, Mary Magdalene often appears as someone who understands and keeps these words. Not out of personal privilege, but out of spiritual disposition. The texts describe her as someone who understands with the heart what others still discuss with the mind. The idea of post-resurrection revelations and dialogues does not detract from the canonical Gospels; she complements them. They show the public announcement. These other texts suggest private deepening. Two levels of transmission that coexisted in early Christianity. When you look at it honestly, you realize that the mystery isn't in the content itself, but in the fact that not everything is meant to be simplified. Some words require maturity, silence, and time. And perhaps that's exactly why they've lived out of the center of the stage for centuries. If the idea of reserved teachings after the resurrection makes sense to you, comment here. These 40 days still hide a lot. And subscribe to the channel, because the next topic touches on something that changes the entire structure of Christian history. If we accept, even for a moment, that women like Mary Magdalene exercised spiritual authority in early Christianity, the impact is enormous. This changes not just individual characters, but the very way we understand the early structure of the Church. In the first centuries, Christian communities met in homes, not in temples. Leadership was not synonymous with a formal position, but with spiritual recognition. In this environment, women appeared as hosts, teachers, and transmitters of oral tradition, something that later texts do not always emphasize. Gradually, with the institutional growth of the Church, authority began to be centralized, standardized, and hierarchical. The space for leadership outside this model has diminished. Not because they disappeared, but because they were no longer recorded with the same prominence. When ancient texts show women teaching, interpreting visions, or conveying revelations, they are not creating modern controversy. They are reflecting a living reality of primitive Christianity, prior to the rigid structures that would come later. Understanding this is not rewriting faith, but broadening our perspective. Perhaps Christianity started out more diverse, more relational, and more inclusive than we have been taught. And this possibility sets the stage for the next question: what happened to these texts when the modern world began to rediscover them? For centuries, these texts remained practically invisible to the Western world. Not because they were lost, but because they were outside the European circuit of power, universities, and the press. It was only from the 19th century onwards that explorers, missionaries, and scholars began to report the existence of Ethiopian manuscripts. When these texts began to attract academic attention, a new challenge emerged: translation. Very few people mastered Ge'ez, and each attempt to translate these writings into modern languages involved delicate choices. Translating is not just exchanging words, it is interpreting concepts, symbols, and worldviews. This led to silent disputes. What should be translated literally? What needed contextualization? What seemed too strange for a modern reader? In many cases, Western versions ended up softening or shortening passages considered theologically uncomfortable. At the same time, universities began to treat these texts as historical objects, not as living scripture. For the Ethiopian tradition, this sounded strange. It was not about relics, but about faith practiced to this day. Two different views on the same material. This clash between living tradition and academic reading explains why so much content still remains unknown to the general public. And it paves the way for the most personal question of all: what does all this change for your faith, here and now? After going through all this, the question stops being just historical and becomes personal. What changes, in practice, when knowing that there are traditions, texts, and voices that have remained outside the main path of Western Christianity? For many people, this doesn't weaken faith, it strengthens it. A more complete faith is not born from automatic repetition, but from sincere search. Reading about the Book of Enoch, the Jubilees, or the Gospel of Mary does not mean abandoning the canonical Gospels. It means expanding the spiritual repertoire, in the same way that someone deepens a topic by studying more than one source. This also takes courage. Questioning is not disrespecting, is to mature. Just like in any area of life, those who grow spiritually learn to deal with complexity, nuance, and even discomfort. Faith stops being fragile when it stops being afraid of questions. A simple step to get started is to set aside time each week for mindful reading. Not as an obligation, but as a dialogue. Compare texts, observe differences, notice what is repeated and what expands. This habit transforms the relationship with spirituality. In the end, this journey invites you to take responsibility for your own search. No one can walk for you. But now, with more pieces of the puzzle on the table, the journey becomes more honest, deeper, and, interestingly, more alive. After everything we've seen from the Ethiopian Bible with 81 books to the post-resurrection dialogues, including Mary Magdalene as the Apostle of the Apostles, it's clear that this story has no place in quick answers. She asks for continuity. Asks for time. It asks for a willingness to look beyond what has always been presented as definitive. Maybe you don't agree with everything. And it's okay. The point here has never been to replace one tradition with another, but to open space for better questions. When faith stops being fragile, it can withstand investigation, comparison, and even silence, especially when silence hides something greater. If this journey has made you rethink the period of 40 days after the resurrection, feminine spiritual authority, or the role of deleted texts, then you have already taken the most important step. You have gone automatic. From here on out, each new piece of content is a piece that fits together more precisely. And the most interesting thing is to realize that this conversation is not happening in isolation. People from different cultures, churches, and countries are asking the same questions now. Something old is rising to the surface, not as a threat, but as an invitation. If this moved you, comment here from where you are watching and write, "I want the next piece." Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because what follows delves into exactly what Jesus taught during this period that almost no one dares to explain. After everything you've heard so far, maybe faith doesn't seem smaller, maybe it seems bigger than before. Bigger because now there is space for questions, for forgotten layers of history, and for voices that have remained on the sidelines for too long. And the question that remains is not about which tradition is right, but about how much you are willing to seek sincerely. What changes when you realize that early Christianity was more diverse, more alive, and deeper than an abridged version? What happens when you view the 40-day period after the resurrection not as silence, but as an invitation to investigate what was said away from the crowds? Perhaps faith stops being something inherited and becomes something chosen. This knowledge does not require rupture, it requires practice. Read more carefully. Compare sources. Having the courage to question without fear of losing God in the process. After all, if the truth is solid, it doesn't break when examined, it reveals itself more clearly. If this content awakened something in you, don't let it stop here. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and continue this journey with us. There are still many pieces of this puzzle waiting to be put in the right place.